On December 14, 2020, President Xi Jinping made a historic announcement. All of China's rural population had been lifted out of extreme poverty under current standards. All 832 impoverished counties across the country had been removed from the poverty list. Nearly 100 million of China's intractably poor were now no longer mired in absolute poverty. Reaching this milestone had taken 8 years of sustained national commitment, championed personally by President Xi and implemented by hundreds of thousands of party and government officials. There have been many challenges, of course, and many problems remain, but it is proper to celebrate the achievement. I myself have been focusing on China's poverty alleviation campaign for over 4 years. I have engaged with poor farmers in remote mountain villages, and I have interviewed officials and experts. I had been looking forward to being in China to witness the culmination by continuing our multi-year series on poverty alleviation. But COVID-19 had other ideas, and I remained sheltered in Santa Monica, California. I am working with my Chinese colleagues to plan, structure, and write the episodes, entrusting them to tell the stories. We focus on the challenges of China meeting its poverty alleviation goals in this year of the global pandemic, to be closer to China. For centuries, these rattan ladders along cliffs were the only means of access to the outside world for locals from a cliff village in southwest Sichuan province's Daliang Mountains. The children here used to climb through the steep mountains for over 2 hours to reach their school. In May 2020, 84 poverty-stricken households from this village bid farewell to their cliff-high adobe houses and moved into their new apartments in Jiaojia County, some 75 kilometers away. These new buildings with yellow walls and rows of blue-gray tiles are their new homes. The residents belong to China's Yi ethnic group, and the buildings are designed to reflect their aesthetics. Mose Labo is one of those who are relocating. His new 100 square meter, 3-bedroom apartment is a big improvement from the old one. When he and his family moved in, the apartment was already furnished, all subsidized by local and provincial governments.
My children won't need to climb up and down the cliffs to go to school anymore. My wife is pregnant with our 3rd child. Moving here makes it very convenient for us to go to the hospital for exams.
In this new community, about 18,000 residents from remote and isolated villages were relocated here. This is Sichuan Province's largest relocation program for the poor. The county is now taking measures to promote the employment of relocated residents, including providing training sessions and building an agricultural industrial park nearby. The site of the Cliff Village will be developed into a scenic spot to help boost income.
Next, we'll take actions to revitalize our village. By developing tourism, we hope to make the village a better place. I hope that we can achieve a fairly prosperous life for our villagers, and this is the goal of our next step.
At the beginning of 2020, nationwide, there were 52 counties with 5.5 million people still trapped in extreme poverty. How can such a large number of intractably poor people get lifted out of poverty in just 1 year?
It's been several years since we carried out poverty alleviation campaign. The work that has been done at early stages laid solid foundation for these most impoverished 52 counties. It includes developing competitive industries, finding jobs for the locals, relocation and better ecological protection, and etc. But there is a time lag between policy measures and its maximum effect. At the same time, as we had fewer counties struggling on the poverty line, we can divert more resources and effort to the counties left behind.
Now, government have a special policy for those counties. Number one, all those monies, resource, additional. So every year, central government increasing the investment or the money budget allocated to poverty. And by last year, in not years, actually start from last year, all the additional resource, monies or materials, all come to that 52 counties, number one. Number two is each county will have governors or deputy governor or party secretary of province. They were responsible for one county. This is you have to go there. You have to use all your power to help this county. And also central government have to have those high power government officials have to link to one such county. Thirdly, we have this called the poverty assistance system model. That means for rich coastal province, coastal cities, you have to relate to help one of those poverty counties. And that, again, by last year, they redo it for those that poverty county. Therefore, more of those coast cities help them.
In 2015, when the blueprint for poverty alleviation was in place, there was a national plan stating which county should be lifted out of poverty in which year. It meant that difficulties had been taken into consideration and related arrangements had been made. In addition, at the end of 2019, the State Council Office for Poverty Alleviation had all the provinces in which these 52 counties were located develop plans on how to supervise the poverty alleviation work. Each county, along with related townships, villages and even households, listed what problems had not been solved and how far away it was from getting out of poverty. Then government departments carried out measures to resolve these problems. So the poverty alleviation work in these 52 counties in 2020 was mainly about solving the problems that had been identified one by one.
According to statistics, we had over 98 million people living in absolute poverty in 2012. The number was approaching 100 million. Well, by the end of 2019, the number had fallen to 5.5 million, which means that we had over 90 million people getting out of absolute poverty, with an average annual reduction of more than 13 million. So it was not a big problem for us to get the 5.5 million people in absolute poverty and the 52 poor counties out of poverty in 2020.
At the end of 2019, the novel coronavirus hit China. The pandemic disrupted many activities. Migrant workers could not return to work. Transportation was interrupted, the development of rural industries such as breeding and processing was retarded, and sales of agricultural products were depressed. The pandemic has added challenges to the poverty eradication work. But in Santai County, southwest China's Sichuan province, workers are receiving extra support to find stable employment. Yang Xiaogui works as a foreman at one of Santai's largest factories. Before 2018, his family was officially registered as impoverished.
I came from a single-parent family in a small village in Santai. I started working right after I graduated from middle school. I traveled between cities looking for a well-paid job, and I ended up right here in my hometown. I now make much more than my father used to and can provide my family with a good standard of living.
Most of Yang's workers are also from impoverished families in nearby villages. Some are new recruits under a cooperation plan between the factory and local government.
This year, many people in Santai are stranded here by the pandemic and cannot go back to Guangdong, Fujian, and elsewhere for work. They've had to find jobs here, so we had this large hiring fair at the county center for anyone interested. All of employees get free boarding during workdays. This has helped those who live very far from here and cannot afford to commute every day.
In order for the poverty eradication work to progress, local authorities have arranged for over 20,000 people, that's almost 2/3 of the county's poor people, to work at local companies. And for those who do not want to quit their jobs outside the county, local government rents buses and trains to take them directly to their destination.
After businesses started reopening nationwide, We've sent at least 15,000 migrant workers to their workplaces. We've arranged for group nucleic acid testing ahead of time. Then coaches pick them up at a gathering point and take them to other cities. The coaches don't stop on the way, except for short breaks. This has greatly lowered the risk of exposure.
John says Santai is a county that exports labor, with migrant workers making up a large part of its population. But he says the county has invested over 7 million yuan in subsidies for the sick, old, and disabled, those who cannot travel too far for work. What challenges did COVID-19 pose to this year's poverty alleviation goals and programs?
It did have an impact in early 2020. After the Spring Festival, migrant workers could not go to the cities to work. But later, as the pandemic was put under control and more measures were carried out. By the end of September, the number of people went out to work from the poor households exceeded the number in 2019. So the pandemic's impact on employment had been greatly mitigated.
Another impact of the pandemic was on the projects relating to the anti-poverty campaign. Some projects on road construction, drinking water facilities and industry development had not yet been completed in those 52 counties. But the measures taken to contain the pandemic also cut off transportation of materials and machinery needed for construction, which exerted some impact on the progress of the projects. But as far as I know, by the end of July, factors associated with COVID-19 should have been largely ruled out.
On March 6th, at a large-scale virtual symposium on poverty alleviation, President Xi Jinping gave a clarion call that the goal to lift all rural residents living below the current poverty line out of poverty by the end of 2020 must be realized as scheduled. He called the goal a solemn pledge made by the party to the people. Since 2012, China has mounted the world's largest ever poverty alleviation program. Between the end of 2012 and the end of 2019, over 93 million people were lifted out of poverty. That's about 1,500 poor people every hour. How to evaluate the significance of poverty alleviation to China?
Poverty alleviation is not only about lifting people out of poverty. To fully understand its significance, we should take a historic point of view and regard it against the social economic development settings. From 1949 to the start of reform and opening up, the main issue we solved was political independence, which ensured villagers access to land, the most basic means of production. From an economist's point of view, political independence is not a simple empty statement. It is the cornerstone for poverty reduction. The second stage started with reform and opening up. By making some people get rich first, it showed a direction that others can follow, which encouraged all people to get rid of poverty. The third stage started with the 18th National Congress of the Communist Party of China. It was claimed that the ultimate goal of socialism is to make all ordinary people rich. On the way to a moderately prosperous society, no one should be left behind.
Why did it take such a long time, almost 40 years, for some regions to get out of poverty?
First of all, it is about geoposition. The counties that have just been lifted out of poverty are remote and thereafter in a disadvantageous position in China's industrialization. Because industrialization started from coastal regions and big cities, and then gradually advanced to other regions, it took a longer time for remote regions to get access to this process. This is the first reason. Another reason is that these places are in natural disasters, and their ecological environment is adverse, which also limits development. Finally, from the perspectives of social development and people's qualification, there are also a lot of constraints. People's Mandarin level, their habits and customs, and education background all have an impact on industry development in these regions, and on the competitiveness of their labor force in the market. It is more difficult for people from these regions to get a job when they go to cities. These are some reasons why it took so many years for these places to get out of poverty.
There are over 10 million Yi people in China, about a fourth of whom live in Liangshan. Here in Huaqiu Village, a family workshop specializing in traditional Yi embroidery and ornament work has breathed new life into a traditional craft.
I'm wearing a full set of traditional Yi wedding gown. A wedding gown is usually a family heirloom passed from mother to daughter. But by tradition, only the youngest daughter can inherit the gown. So my father made this new set for me. And one day, I will pass it to my youngest daughter.
Coming from a traditional Yi family, Chu Mu's father is proud of his cultural heritage. The idea of starting a traditional ornament workshop began when he came across tourist sites selling crudely made Yi handicrafts. That made him uncomfortable.
When I traveled to Yunnan and Guizhou, I saw some shops making a lot of money out of Yi ornament. And I thought to myself, everyone in my village knows how to forge silver ornament, and we do it better.
Orders for Chumu's products come from places as far away as Guangdong province. But despite his success, he says the workshop is not just a business for him, but an opportunity for his children to keep in touch with their roots. Some Westerners think that as a result of the poverty alleviation campaign, the culture of ethnic minorities have been impacted, even threatened. Can ethnic cultures be kept intact while bringing them out of poverty?
I think that could be a misunderstanding. In fact, the culture is important. First, the poverty program, poverty alleviation program, usually is not directly linked to the culture part. Actually, we protect the culture. Some of the village, what we did in Miao minority, it is a lot of, because people have more income, they have a time to doing a dancing, and every night, and those people have a time, they have enough food, they were dancing together. This is their culture. There were 1,000 years they always doing that. And also because we have a tourist come, and then tourists very much interested in this program because they visit there and say, oh, this is very nice, very beautiful. They buy it. So the culture even better is not destroying. But if you think the Hungary is their culture, or they're living in a very shabby, very bad housing in the culture, that definitely will change it. Right? Let the people have a basic living situation. I would say that's strengthening their culture is not like destroy their culture.
My suggestion mainly focuses on how to mitigate negative impact. For example, when ethnic minorities are relocated from remote mountainous villages to towns and cities, I think it is important to help them preserve traditional culture and leave spaces where they can sing and dance and can do their handcrafts. We can't let them live in poverty in the middle of remote mountains for the sake of the protection of tradition. We can't let them lead a life which has no access to basic necessities, such as food, and which can't meet people's needs on education and healthcare. I think that to ethnic minorities, poverty alleviation has a bigger and more positive impact on them. Development of some minority areas once lagged behind. The poverty alleviation campaign helped these regions build up infrastructure for education and healthcare, and industries have also developed to some degree from which people can have higher income.
The so-called happiness index is widely used to evaluate people's living standard. The areas of extreme poverty are relatively close to the outside world, and people living there had little or no access to information from the outside world. They had no idea of what life could be like. Under this circumstance, their happiness index was relatively high, but overall speaking, it's at a low level. We did research and found out that young people from these areas, especially those who have been working in developed regions, didn't think their happiness index was high.
Some Western analysts say that by adopting the $1.9 a day poverty line, China did not set a high standard for its poverty reduction campaign. What's your take on it? By what standard does China set its poverty line?
China's poverty line is unique in the world. The standard for poverty alleviation is actually made up of two parts. The first part is equivalent to the poverty line in other countries, and the per capita disposable income for farmers was set at 2,300 RMB at constant 2010 prices. Compared with the standards set by the World Bank, this amount equaled around $2.2 a day at 2011 purchasing power parity. To put it in another way, the amount is 20% higher than the $1.9 global poverty line. Besides this 2,300 RMB threshold, we also have a standard called 3 guarantees to make sure that poor people have access to free compulsory education, basic health care and housing security, along with safe drinking water. Overall, the 2,300 income line plus the above-mentioned guarantees is what China set as its poverty alleviation standard.
Our standard for poverty alleviation reflects changes in people's concept. We think that poverty is not only measured by income or from the consumption perspective. We introduced multi-dimension. The standard of income is set to ensure that the basic living needs of rural poor populations are met. The 3 guarantees on education, medical services, and housing emphasize human development.
How to understand the comprehensiveness of China's measures? Can these standards meet basic demands of the poor? Will these put pressure on local finance?
According to the existing international anti-poverty theory, to solve poverty problems, we must give poor people development opportunities and empower them, which is what the 3 guarantees is all about. The most important part is to have the next generation, no matter their families rich or poor, stand on the same starting line, especially in terms of having access to education. And when the poor people get sick, Social Security is in place, which guarantees that each individual has basic social rights. Our target is not only about meeting poor populations' basic daily necessities, providing them opportunities and safeguarding their dignity. It's also about blocking the intergenerational transmission of poverty, which is of utter importance in poverty alleviation.
How to empower the poor to prevent them from being trapped in poverty?
First of all, most of the poor population who are able to work have accepted vocational training or have had relatively stable jobs with the help of government. This means that this group of people's employment has been resolved. It is an important indicator. Secondly, by employing local natural resources, some impoverished regions developed agricultural products, laying down foundation for further industrial development. The third biggest change is improvement of infrastructure and public services in poverty-stricken areas. I think it is also the most obvious one. Facilities on transportation, energy, drinking water, education, healthcare have improved markedly over the past few years. The fourth aspect, I think, is on institutional arrangements. For example, some poor people in these poor areas are incapacitated, including seniors, the sick, and the disabled. China has set up a relatively complete social security system for these vulnerable groups to ensure that after being lifted out of poverty, they can still get support.
China had long set the national goal of becoming a moderately prosperous society by 2020. But President Xi Jinping insisted that China could not claim to be a moderately prosperous society, no matter how high its GDP and income per capita, if even one Chinese citizen remained in absolute poverty. To me, while all political systems have trade-offs, one of the probative insights into the governance and organizational structure of China's party-led political system is the revealing parallelism between China's war to eradicate extreme poverty and China's war to contain the novel coronavirus pandemic. The structural similarities are striking. President Xi's commitment, party leadership, national mobilization. China's success in fighting poverty is due in part to its realistic recognition of problems, especially falsification of data and corrupt misallocation of poverty funds. President Xi stresses that poverty eradication is a common ideal of humanity, and while each country has its own culture and conditions, China is willing to share its experiences. While China this year will rightly celebrate the success of poverty eradication, after the festivities have concluded, there will still be substantial challenges going forward. Most important, how can China make poverty alleviation sustainable? That's next week on Closer to China.